Hello, and welcome to my revisiting of the Phase 1 Marvel movies. So as I am filming this, Black Widow comes out this week, and so I thought I'd do a little bit of a look back at some of the first Marvel movies, also known as Phase 1, which consists of all of the Marvel movies from the first Iron Man all the way up to the first Avengers movie. Chronologically, there are movies and TV shows that take place before the start of the first Iron Man, but I'm covering all of the Marvel content according to when they were released, as opposed to the order they take place in chronologically. I was originally going to try to cover all of the MCU content up until Black Widow, but I quickly realized how overly ambitious that was going to be, especially considering there are multiple TV shows. And even watching all of the movies is about a 30-hour time commitment. So in order to get this video out in a more timely manner in time for the Black Widow movie, I would keep my focus narrow and focus on the Phase 1 Marvel movies. And I'm excited! Some of these movies I haven't actually seen since release, particularly the Iron Man movies. I actually was not allowed to see the Iron Man movies in theaters as a kid. Actually, of Phase 1, the only two movies I ended up seeing in theaters were the Captain America movie and the Avengers. So I think that might explain why emotionally I only really have a big connection towards the movies in Phase 1 that I saw in theaters. I have watched all of the other movies at some point. None of these are a first time watch for me, but up until I rewatched these movies, other than the ones I sort of know really well, I had a harder time recollecting a more detailed version of the events of these movies. These are not gonna be full reviews of any of these movies. Like I said, I just couldn't get too ambitious with what I wanted to do for these kind of revisiting videos, and especially because they include multiple movies and then in later phases multiple TV shows. I think it would just be an unrealistic expectation to set for myself by setting the precedent of doing full reviews for even the first phase, which has the least amount of content. So let's get started with the first being the first Iron Man movie. So now we all know who Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, is, but when this movie came out, they really did have to do a full-on origin story movie to kind of explain his character. And I do still think this movie is essential viewing to understand the wider Marvel Cinematic Universe. The beginning is very strong. It gives you a very good sense of Tony's character very quickly, but after the opening, that first third while he's stuck in a cave after being kidnapped by our mysterious, conveniently not too specific terrorists, that section does drag a bit in my opinion, but it does pick up once he gets back to America and really starts wielding the Iron Man identity. It is going to be a little jarring to see Rhodes played by Terrence Howard as opposed to John Cheadle like in the later movies. In the few scenes he is in, Terrence Howard does have a very different take on Rhodes than Don Cheadle would, but obviously this was before Marvel was locking people into 6-movie 10-year contracts, so there are gonna be a few actor switch-ups here, one of which I will mention later. I did not realize how long it has been since this first Iron Man movie came out until I was watching this movie and I realized nobody, and I mean literally nobody, has a smartphone. Of course, Tony Stark still has his advanced technology that's not quite looking like retro tech yet, at least, but certain other things like the cell phones and the allusions to mad money, which, fun fact, I did not learn this until I was doing research for this video, is still running. Like, when I think of mad money, I think of it, yeah, as being this kind of relic of the 2000s, but it's still going. They talked about unemployment a few days ago, and there is an incredible amount of product placement in this first Iron Man movie. And from a financial standpoint, I can understand why they did this. While the first Iron Man is by no means as flashy as some of the later Marvel movies get, it also was not cheap by any means. And because this first outing was such a big risk, Iron Man had had a cartoon, I believe in the 70s very briefly, but otherwise was certainly not a household name. So I could understand why why the producers would want to offset some of the potential loss by adding in a lot of product placement. However, with that being said, the amount of product placement in the movie, particularly how much of it is overtly integrated into character interaction, into dialogue, it's distracting. And this movie was the first movie to introduce S.H.I.E.L.D. And the way they introduce and explain S.H.I.E.L.D. in this movie is honestly kind of confusing if you don't already know what S.H.I.E.L.D. is as an organization in the comics. I will talk about this more once we get to Thor, but I think particularly the first phase of Marvel movies downplays a lot of the more fantastical elements of Marvel to the detriment of the story. And I feel like S.H.I.E.L.D., at least in the first Iron Man movie, is a victim of this. I think it's also because of the nature of Coulson's character as sort of the more goofier, friendlier agent. The way he explains S.H.I.E.L.D. almost makes it seem kind of like a niche, quirky, do-nothing, no-name organization, when really, by this point, S.H.I.E.L.D. is already worldwide and has a lot of power. In all fairness, we only know this through the hindsight of later movies, but that makes its introduction in this first Iron Man even more confusing and almost seem like a retcon. Now we've come to the big question mark in the room, and that is the Incredible Hulk. From an acting perspective, this is definitely a skippable movie. While the difference in character interpretation between Edward Norton and Mark Ruffalo is not as stark compared to Terrence Howard versus Don Cheadle's interpretation of Rhodes, the two actors definitely have a very different presence as Bruce Banner. And from a story perspective, with the exception of the possible return of the Abomination, there is nothing in the Incredible Hulk that is completely and totally new, that isn't somewhere along the line later reiterated in the later movies, particularly in the first Avengers movie, with the one big story beat that connects the Incredible Hulk to all of the other Marvel movies being that Bruce Banner is experimenting with gamma radiation in order to try to duplicate the effects of the super soldier serum used on Captain America. So that is about as much as I can comment on Incredible Hulk because I couldn't see it for this retrospective. It is not on Disney Plus like nearly every other piece of MCU content. I believe as I am filming this, the only place it is available is on Prime Video, but I do not have Prime Video, so luckily, like I've said, I have seen all of the Phase 1 Marvel movies before, so it's not like I'm talking about a movie I've never seen, but it has been some time since I've seen it, so I can't give super detailed thoughts on this movie the way I can with the others. Alrighty, now on to Iron Man 2. Now I mentioned at the beginning of this video that I was not allowed to watch the Iron Man movies when they were first released in theaters. And rewatching Iron Man 2, I very much understand why now. While at this point in time, Marvel had already become a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, the first several Marvel movies in the first phase were distributed by Paramount Pictures, with the exception of The Incredible Hulk, of course. That, for another reason, is a special case. So even though, at least in title, Paramount Pictures and the Walt Disney Company are really only distributors and marketers of the Marvel movies, they're technically not involved in the production process. You can definitely feel the influence and the difference in style between the two film companies. So what I mean to say by this is the Paramount Marvel movies definitely have a lot more of an adult edge to them, and this is very much true, probably the most true, in Iron Man 2. I think this can also be attributed to the character of Tony Stark, particularly in this moment of his character arc. But just in general, this is probably the filthiest Marvel movie out of the entire cinematic universe. There are F-bombs, there are so many sex jokes. Also, the Paramount Marvel movies have a weird obsession with showing choreographed dance sequences of scantily clad women. This happens in both of the Iron Man movies and Captain America the First Avenger. However, I will say for the Iron Man movies, this does make sense because it very much emphasizes Tony Stark's sense of showmanship and womanizing. Does not make as much sense for Captain America. So Iron Man 2 is kind of a bad sequel in that it retreads a lot of the same plot points of the first movie. Tony Stark basically has the same character arc he had in the first movie, where a change in his life circumstances forces him to become more humble and to reconcile with his emotions and his inner self. So realistically, I think a character like Tony Stark would need to learn the same lesson multiple times. In this movie, his sense of character progression, particularly compared to the first movie, feels very repetitive and extraneous. Also, I thought the sequence introducing Tony Stark's father, Howard Stark, with the kind of wonderful world of Disney, introducing Epcot sequence towards the beginning, was very cute. I have a feeling it's like an allusion to Disney now owning Marvel. So yeah, Iron Man 2. I often hear Iron Man 2 being one of the worst Marvel movies next to The Incredible Hulk. I wouldn't say it's bad, but like I said, the character beats are quite extraneous, and particularly in the final third part of the movie, it loses a lot of its cohesion. So okay, on to Thor. Now Thor is interesting for me from a personal standpoint. I remember not liking Thor when it first came out. I was 11 when this movie first came out, and I thought they focused way too much on the love story, but I also weirdly found the kind of magical elements of it boring. And while I definitely still think the beginning exposition at the start of the movie is a little lazy, that first sequence of Thor and friends in the Nine Realms is a lot more entertaining than I remember it being. I remember people being really split on Thor and his part of the Marvel Universe when his movies first started coming out. I think back then we were still kind of getting off the train of 2000s hyper-realism, and so the idea of fantasy characters in very outlandish outfits was still a little bit harder of a pill to swallow for some audiences, compared to where we are now, where we're almost on the opposite side of the spectrum, where audiences are really craving the more fantastical elements of the Marvel Universe. Also, when I was a kid, I thought the idea of Odin punishing Thor by banishing him made no sense at all. Like I said, I was like 11. But now as an adult, Odin's thought process makes a lot more sense to me. Like, how is Thor supposed to learn anything when he's an all-powerful god and really doesn't see consequences for anything? Especially when at this stage, Thor believes the solution to everything is fighting and brute strength with his powers. Also, another thing I find interesting about some of these earlier phase Marvel movies is that they very much try to science their way out of magic. This is something I feel like they still occasionally do, like in WandaVision, but I feel like this era of Marvel movie is particularly guilty of not trusting their audience enough to just say, it's magic, and just move on. They feel like they need to have a scene or two here of techno babble to be like, well, you say it's magic, but really it's science with a different name. So overall, I like this movie a lot more than I remember. I think it is also my evolving tastes as I get older. I am planning on reviewing the other phases in the future. Let me know if you are interested in that. But I wonder if my opinion on Thor: The Dark World has changed as well. Like I said, I remember not liking Thor all that much. And then Thor: The Dark World, I have not even finished watching. I got about halfway through it and I fell asleep. So yes, if you are looking forward to me reviewing the other phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, do subscribe. So next up, onto my favorite of the Phase 1 Marvel movies, Captain America, the First Avenger. For me, my favorite Phase 1 movie is really close between Captain America and the Avengers, but I will have to say, Captain America edges out the Avengers as my personal favorite by just a little bit. Captain America is basically a Cinderella story, a Cinderfella story, if you will. Captain America, in my opinion, is also one of the funniest of the Phase 1 Marvel movies, almost to its detriment. I think because a lot of it is more on the lighthearted side, I have some trouble taking its few serious scenes seriously. Like the scene where Captain America is alone in the bar after Bucky falls off the train. I think it's partially because I've read the comics and I knew Bucky was gonna be coming back. But a scene where Captain America is by himself trying to drown his sorrows in alcohol after his best friend dies does not generally fit well into kind of the overall tone that I think Captain America was going for. However, with that being said, Captain America the First Avenger has probably the saddest ending out of all of the Phase 1 Marvel movies. I genuinely remember crying in the theater during the scene where Steve is talking to Agent Carter for the last time. And then I cried even more when he wakes up and realizes he's been asleep for 90 years. But also, I was the most excited to see where his story was gonna go. Also, I do have to say, I think that this movie had the lowest budget out of all of the Phase 1 movies, or at least was most stretched on the budget they were given. Period pieces are already expensive to begin with, and due to the nature of period pieces, there's often little to no opportunity for product placement. So it's not like the other Marvel movies where product placement can be used to pad out the budget. While I feel like this doesn't affect the film in major ways, I can see it coming out in some small areas, like the fact that all of the gun and action sound effects are weirdly cartoony and generic. And in one or two of the indoor sets, you can kind of tell where they scrimped on the budget a little bit. Particularly, I am thinking of the scene where Captain America first finds Bucky in the Hydra base. It is literally an empty room that's been tinted green. But overall, yes, Captain America is my favorite. And moving on to the final Phase 1 Marvel movie, The Avengers. So while this movie did get edged out of being my favorite, I do still have a special emotional connection to this movie. I saw this in theaters as a middle school graduation present, and the energy at that time to see this movie in theaters and finally see this thing that's been hinted at for so long, but nobody was really sure if they were gonna actually pull off. It was an event. It really was something unique. I honestly don't have that much to say about this movie. I feel like if you've seen one Marvel movie, it's probably this one. And it's a solid movie. It's not like high art or anything, but it is very entertaining. The scene where Black Widow meets with Bruce Banner to invite him to the Avengers initiative is surprisingly tense in retrospective, considering the relationship we know them to go on to have in the later movies. Many of the characters treat Bruce Banner as a very serious threat, which of course in retrospect we know is a recurring theme that will come back again. Part of I think what makes this movie really work is they have a very good villain. Tom Hiddleston does a very good Loki, even though I'm actually not that big of a fan of Loki. Spoilers for my Loki Disney Plus series review. We're still on episode 4, so I haven't seen all of it. While I like Loki in concept as a character, and I certainly enjoy Hiddleston playing him, sometimes his dialogue gets on my nerves. I particularly like when he tries to get into other characters' heads, like in his scene with Black Widow, but when he's monologuing or trying to talk circles around people, that's when my enjoyment of him as a character kind of drops a little bit. It doesn't happen as much in Avengers as it does in the Loki Disney Plus series, but it's definitely already here. But something I did not remember about Loki as a villain in this movie is that for a magic-based villain, he's very physical. I think when we think magic-based villains, we think of them fighting at a distance, kind of shooting magic bolts out of their hands, or in Loki's case, his spear. But no, Loki is introduced by, like, stabbing somebody. I know in Thor, we already knew he had the knife-throwing abilities on top of his magic, but when he's the main villain and you have his magical abilities paired paired with this almost brutal physical fighting style, it feels a lot more real and visceral. Another thing I do have to note, it is alluded to even in the film that Coulson faked his death, and it is confirmed in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I think Coulson got an okay introduction in this Avengers movie, but his arc is definitely going to seem incomplete and definitely not really have an impact if you haven't seen the previous movies, particularly the Iron Man movies. Or even Thor, although in Thor, Coulson is more of an antagonist. Also, this is my first time watching the full Battle of New York sequence in the final third of the movie outside of a theater. But I do remember even thinking watching this in the theater that the Battle of New York sequence does drag a little. I know particularly the Avengers movies loves their action sequences, and up until this point in the movie there really hasn't been any kind of big action set piece fight scene other than the Avenger versus Avenger fight scene that Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man have in the woods. But I personally feel that the Battle of New York sequence at the ending could have been trimmed down by maybe 2 minutes. But yes, those are my thoughts on all of the Phase 1 Marvel movies. Let me know what you thought. Did you see the Phase 1 Marvel movies in theaters? Were you like me, where you saw some of them but not all of them? Let me know, and until then, I will see you next time.